The women, when they went to the tomb on that first Easter morning, fully expected Jesus' body to be in the tomb where they left it. When they get there, Jesus' body is not there, but they find in Luke's gospel 2 angels who say to them, "Why do you look for the living among the dead?" But then you might notice that they also say, "Do you not remember while he was still with you in Galilee that he told you he was going to have to suffer and be crucified and that he would rise again? Do you not remember?" Remember? Friends, they didn't remember. I think this scene is kind of amazing because here they are on the threshold of the empty tomb on Easter morning. They are at the place and near the event that changed human history and the cosmic order forever. And the angels are like, "What's wrong with you? Don't you remember he told you this?" So the women go back to find the boys, the disciples, and they find them still very bravely locked in the upper room. And do we think they remembered? They did not remember. They tell him that the tomb was empty. He has risen from the dead, and Luke tells us they did not believe them. They thought it was an idle tale, like they were making something up. I find this strange for 2 reasons. One, Jesus did tell them, and I kind of think that's something that you would remember. Like if I told you about me, like I'm going to die, but don't worry, I'll be back for coffee in a couple days. Wouldn't you file that away? Like that's, like hold it off for a psychiatric evaluation maybe in my near future. They didn't remember. But I also find it strange because not only did they remember Jesus not telling them, they didn't remember, but they also didn't remember the long story of God and his people. And I think if they had remembered the long story of God and his people, that they might have thought that something was afoot. For the story goes something like this. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth and every form of life which teems across the face of the earth, including us. And God put us in a garden, and God gave us one command. Surely we could follow one thing, right? And then we didn't. And this is a devastating moment in the 2nd chapter of the Bible. As you read it, you could almost think that this could be the end. God is mad. God is disappointed. God could have ended the entire human experiment right then and there. I mean, if we can't be trusted with that one little thing, how can we be trusted with anything else? And God, in his anger, expels us from the garden, and we go east of Eden. But there, we find blessing and peace. We are fruitful and multiply, and God is every bit as present with us outside the garden as he is inside the garden. It could have been the end, but it wasn't. And then humanity continues to be fruitful and multiply, but then not only do we break one little thing, but we end up violating God's order in just about every creative matter that we could think of. And God again is disappointed and angry, and so God then sends the rains, right? And a flood for 40 days and 40 nights. Again, as you read the story, like it could have been the end. This could have been the full end of the human experiment. But it wasn't, because there was an ark and a dove that goes out, and the rains stop, and a rainbow arcs across the sky, and there is a promise that God makes with us. And again, life bursts forth, and there's hope, and we are fruitful and multiply, and the earth teems with life once again. It could have been the end, but it isn't. And then God puts his focus onto one family, the family of Abraham and Sarah, which becomes the family of Isaac and Rebekah, which becomes the family of Jacob and Rachel, which becomes the nation of Israel. And very quickly, really before they even become a nation, they become enslaved in Egypt for 400 years to Pharaoh. This is how civilizations and nations die. No one remembers slave peoples 4,000 years ago. The Israelites really could have been lost to the sands of time in the Egyptian desert. It could have been the end of the story. But it wasn't. God sets a bush on fire, and God sends Moses as his ambassador to Pharaoh, and there's plague after plague, and finally God's people walk out of Egypt into the wilderness, and 40 years later they walk into the land that had been promised them. They are finally a nation with their own home. It could have been the end, but it is a new beginning. 900 years after that, the Israelites are completely clobbered by the Babylonians. They crush Jerusalem, completely breaking it apart. They take the survivors of that war and they haul them hundreds of miles away to Babylon to serve as slaves. The Babylonians do everything they can to squeeze the Jewishness out of them, to remove their identity and their culture and religion. They say, you're not going to be eating kosher anymore. We're going to give you a Babylonian diet. You're not going to have your Hebrew names. We're going to give you Babylonian names. You don't need to worry about your old primitive religion. We're going to give you your new Babylonian gods. Again, it could have been the end. This is how nations die. Have you heard about how the Hittites are doing lately? The Jebusites, the Aramites, have they made the news? No, they're gone. Those nations have been wiped off the face of the earth. They are just archaeological sites now to dig up and wonder about. That could have been the end of the Israelites. But 70 years after their defeat by the Babylonians are defeated by the Persians. The Persian king looks at this new group of slaves that he's inherited, and he says, go home. Go home. I don't need you here. In fact, take some money. Take lots of money and rebuild your land. It could have been the end, but there's a new beginning, and there's life, and there's hope, and there's freedom, and there's liberty in their own land. A renewed promise that God makes with them. This was just the highlights. I figured you all might have brunch later today, so I didn't want to do like every little story along the way, but in between those stories, you can find lots of little stories that are just like this, where the people of God suffer defeat and loss and despair. But then there is this unforeseen turn of events that brings about victory and joy and life. We begin to see that life cannot be held down, that love will not be held down, that God will always, always, always win out in the end. And so I think the disciples, as they watched Jesus be betrayed and arrested and tried and beaten and crucified and laid in the tomb, as devastating as this moment is, that their friend, their Lord, their Master, the Messiah, God's Son, God incarnate, as devastating as this moment is, that he has come among us and we killed him. There is no lower moment in the entire story of God's people than God being laid in that tomb. But even if the disciples didn't remember that Jesus told them this was going to happen, shouldn't they have remembered the long story? Like, they might not have known what was coming next, but they might have known that with every defeat, there is going to be some unforeseen set of events that is going to turn this defeat into something of a victory, that there will be joy again. But they didn't remember. And I get it, because sometimes I don't remember either. When horrible things happen to me or in the world, I still wonder why. When things fall apart, I still panic and I try and hold it all together and patch it up as quickly as I possibly can. When my heart is broken, I sometimes wonder if I will ever be made whole again. I forget. They forgot. And if we're honest, we probably all do. But today is Easter. Today is the day of resurrection. Today is the day when we are reminded about the power of God, bringing forth life and love and hope. Today we remember that in the resurrection, the cosmic order is shifted and the power of death is lost of its sting forever. Remember that the resurrection, it's not just that Jesus came back. There's a meme that goes around nowadays at Easter, one of those little internet cartoons, and it's the closed tomb, and there's a little speech bubble that's coming out of the tomb, and Jesus says, BRB, be right back. It's cute. It's cute. I look for it every year now. But it's not just that he came back, because the resurrection is not a resuscitation. A resuscitation is when someone has died, their heart stops beating, and we get their hearts going again. People do get resuscitated. Some of us are trained in CPR and in resuscitation. The vestry bought a defibrillator. It's sitting underneath Father's chair in case, God forbid, we need to throw some juice at somebody on Sunday morning. Lazarus, if you remember, was resuscitated. He died, Jesus came, brought him back to life. But then Lazarus died again. Right? He's not still walking around 2,000 years later. If he was, that would be something, right? That would make the news. But he's not. Resurrection is not that. Resurrection is something different. Jesus, when he comes back, it's him. It's him in his body, but he's also changed. He's been, in the words of the first lesson we heard this morning, he's been made new. It's him, but now he's able to enter into a locked room. He just appears and then disappears. He walks with his disciples now for miles, and they don't know it's him until he breaks bread in front of them. He speaks to Mary Magdalene, one of his closest friends, and she doesn't know it's him until he calls her by name. It's him. He's got his wounds from the crucifixion still on his body, which is a whole other sermon. He rises with his wounds. He rises in his woundedness. But he has changed. It's why, unlike Lazarus, we can say about Jesus that he still lives. And it's that power of resurrection that we, by grace and by faith, are offered a share in, so that his resurrection becomes our resurrection. So that what happens in him happens in us. So on this Easter day, remember that. Remember that. Remember when you're in the deep hole, that there is no hole that is deep enough that God cannot shine a little glimmer of hope in it. Remember that on those days that are so heavy with loss and despair, that there is no day that God cannot turn into one of joy. Remember that there is no grave so laden with grief that God cannot walk right out of it. Because that is who God is. Always. In the whole story, the whole thing. Don't you remember? Happy Easter.